The number one rule for an exercise professional is do not hurt your client. Over the many decades of me being an exercise professional and training thousands and thousands and thousands of clients, I've never had one ever say, hey Kman, can you injure me? Or can I help me achieve this goal but injure me in the process? No, because they want to achieve their goal safely. And what I do know is that an injured client is not going to be achieving any goal, whether that be a sporting goal, a lifetime goal, a lifestyle goal, whatever it might be. So you have to make sure that when you design an exercise program and get them to do it, that it's going to be effective, it's going to be efficient, and most of all, it's going to be safe, because they didn't sign up to get injured. If anything, they signed up not to get injured or to rehabilitate an injury while achieving a goal. And I've learnt the hard way. I've been doing this for many decades, and in the early years I didn't have the knowledge that we have today when it comes to exercise effectiveness and safety and efficiency. So back in those days, and a lot of people still do this today, they just do things because everyone else is doing it. And we're at the time of the Olympics at the moment, and that reminds me of back in preparation for the 1992 Olympics. I was training an Olympic team, and we were 8 weeks out. So I had them in the gym doing their strength training session, and as I was in there, I was supervising somebody, and in the background, one of my athletes, I heard this cling, clang, and a scream, and that's not a good sound from one of your Olympic athletes 8 weeks out from the Olympic Games. So I turned around and they had dropped the weight and misbalanced the weight, and they were on the ground. Not a good sign. So straight away that feeling of, I guess, panic comes into your mind. Oh my gosh, what have I done? Have I just destroyed the Olympic dream for one of my Olympic athletes? And that particular athlete, this was their last attempt at the Olympics to win a medal, because they were in their early 30s and in the twilight of their sporting career. And that person had subluxed their shoulder, their glenohumeral joint. And that's not a good thing to have when you're getting ready for the Olympic Games, a subluxation in the shoulder joint. So that was a gut-wrenching feeling, that I destroyed someone's dream. And they didn't even injure themselves doing their sport. They injured it in the gym doing strength training, which isn't even their sport. The whole idea of strength training was to stop them from getting injured and to improve their sporting performance. And I had thought I've just destroyed that. Fortunately, in a good relationship with the sports physiotherapist, who was a good friend of mine, we nurtured that person back to elite performance, and they end up medaling in the games. But geez, that was certainly a massive intervention in my thought process, and started to make me really think, why am I doing this exercise for that person, and how does that work, and how can I justify it? And what's interesting, the exercise I gave them was an overhead easy bar tricep extension, and I'd got that exercise off a renowned Olympic coach or strength coach in the USA for a similar sport, wasn't the same sport, and I thought, wow, they're doing this, so that must be really, really effective for my athlete, and you go through the process, yes, because you take your shoulder above your head and you get a pre-stretch and a long-headed tricep, therefore you get more activation on the tricep to develop the tricep action, so that's going to be beneficial in their sporting movement, which was kayaking. And that was my justification, but it was mainly, hey, because if the US coach does it, then it must be okay. And then I went through my own self-justification, being affected by that person's opinion of why I did that exercise. And it wasn't long before I realized that exercise wasn't just dysfunctional, it wasn't even specific to the sporting movement, but it was actually quite unsafe based on the joint position I put their shoulder in, which had no relationship to the joint position in their sport. So today's session is not to be a follower, just to blindly follow other people or what the trendy exercises are or what the other gurus say, but you to be able to think for yourself. And as I say in the Max program, I'm not here to tell you what to think, but how to think. And then you can make up your own informed decisions and do the best by your client and help them achieve their goals in the most effective, in the most time efficient, and most importantly the safest way. Because I see now a plethora of unsafe exercises of people doing, because people are now so creative because they want attention and likes, I suppose, on social media of their new creative ways to do exercise. And it's almost a competition of how can we design the most craziest creative exercise programs. And people say, wow, that must be the secret. I don't understand it, but it's really complicated, therefore it must work. So today's session is on safety, and I'm going to go through some basic principles that's going to be useful from a biomechanical and anatomical point of view. When you look at any exercise, don't look at what people say, what it does, and the attached benefits and the so-called promises that's attached to it and all the outcomes. I want you to look at purely from a safety point of view. And I always say when you look at any exercises, put your x-ray goggles on. So put your x-ray goggles on when you look at an exercise, so you're not actually looking at the muscles. What you're looking at is the skeletal system, and what you see is the skeleton, you see the joints, you see the ligaments and the tendons, you see the cartilage, the menisci, the bursas, all those things that are the moving mechanical parts of the body. Because when you get injured, if a lot of the injuries that people get that stop them from using their muscles are joint injuries, whether that be osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis or bursitis or capsulitis or any other form of itis that you can imagine that is associated with many times the wear and tear and the stresses that are placed on joints. Because if your joints aren't working, the body's not working. If your axle of your car and the wheel of your car is all not working, the car's not going anywhere. So I want you to look at all exercises through your x-ray goggles, and so you can see what and I call it inside out anatomy. A lot of people look at the outside and go in, and most people can't go very far in because they don't know much anatomy. They just see pecs, lats, quads, hammies, calves, bis and tris, which is all the superficial muscles, and they see them moving, so that must be good, but they don't know why that particular action, yes, those muscles are working, but those muscles might be putting undue stresses across the joint with that movement pattern. So today is not looking at exercises, but more looking at movement patterns. And movement and exercises are comprised of different movement patterns of joint actions. So get your x-ray goggles on, and then you're going to see what's happening to the joint, because if you wear out the joint or destroy the joint, then you're not going to be able to work the muscles to achieve your goal anyway. So look at exercises or movement patterns from inside out, not outside in, and that way you're going to see what the long-term effects of any movement pattern is going to have on that joint, which will also affect the long-term benefit from a muscular point of view and the associated systems that you're trying to stimulate, whether it be the respiratory system or whether it be the cardiovascular system, the muscular system, the endocrine system. So I won't go into that today. So I'm going to go through some basic things to consider. Now, first of all, I want you to imagine the body. We're upright creatures. We stand in the upright, we move upright. We're very different to a lizard, a snake, or even a chimpanzee who tends to work on, or a dog who tends to not walk on two legs. So we're upright. So our joints are basically on top of each other, whether it be our vertebrae. Each vertebrae is on top of each other, tiered up. My upper body's on top of my hip, and my femurs on top of my knee, and my knees on top of my ankle. Everything's basically on top of each other. So I want you to imagine that we're almost like pieces of Lego, and you have Legos, we have two pieces of Lego and they join together. And that joint of those two Lego pieces is the joint, because the joint is where two bones connect, two articulating surfaces connect. And in that connection, you're going to have different mechanisms designed for movement and to reduce the chances of wear and tear, friction, such as the cartilage, or whether it be the menisci, or whatever it might be, and the stability of the ligaments, and obviously the attachment of the tendons. So we're basically like Lego pieces on top of each other. Therefore, we're very much designed to be able to withstand pressure forces going down through the body this way. Right, so imagine if you have a whole bunch of Lego pieces on top of each other, and I push down those Lego pieces, then it's going to be very stable. Each one of those connecting Lego pieces, called the joints, are very well stable. But if I get that Lego piece this way and then I cut across it, push across it, then it's going to break. So going across the body is going to create the joints aren't designed for that in terms of stability wise. So straight away, a good clue is any force that goes across the body, across the joints, is going to be potentially hazardous in terms of the amount of force that goes through, but also the inability of the joint to withstand high amounts of force, because joints many times can withstand great compression forces or traction forces. So I want you to put one hand up and this hand up, put them together. Imagine that's one bone and that's another bone, whether it be the femur and the hip, or the tibia and the femur, or whether it be the radius and the ulna, whatever it might be. That's the joint, and I want you to put those two hands together, and that's the joint. On the surfaces of the joint is a smooth articular cartilage, which is like an inside of a coconut feel. It's very smooth and it reduces the amount of friction. If I got you to put both hands together and push together, push, you're not going to cause any damage to these surfaces, because that's called compression forces. As I was saying, if in the upright position, that's compression forces. So my vertebral column is designed for compression forces. My hip and my knee are designed for compression forces. So therefore, it can withstand high amounts of compression forces as my tier level of Lego pieces. I can press them and I can't break them. They're very, very stable. If I go the other way, if I take both hands and I connect it this way and I pull them apart like this, and I pull apart, you're not going to damage anything in here. There's no wear and tear. It's just, and then we call that traction forces. So the body is quite capable of withstanding traction forces, because there's no actually pressure pushed together on the two bony or articulating surfaces. So if I'm doing chin-ups, or if I'm doing a row, then traction forces aren't going to cause detrimental effects onto the joints, because they're going to be separate. If this is going to be stretching maybe the ligaments a little bit and relieving a bit of pressure on the joint. So compression forces, traction forces. So any movement pattern that has compression forces in the upright position, if I'm doing a squat, all my Lego pieces, all my joints are in alignment on top of each other, I maintain good form where I don't flex the back, you know, like round it like that, because if I round my back like that, the Lego pieces are going to do that, and all of a sudden I've got compression, I've got a more concentrated compression force on one side, plus also it's now become less stable rather than being directly on top of each other. Joints are designed to be directly on top of each other, not flexed or extended with compression forces. They can do it, but if you want the strongest position, you want to maintain good postural position. Things such as squats, if I'm doing a push-up, that creates compression forces. If I'm doing anything which has compression forces, with a good posture, with the joints all aligned in their correct postural position, we're okay. If I do traction forces through it, such as chin-ups, where I'm actually the traction force of the glenohumeral joint, the humerus going into the glenohumeral cavity, that's a traction force. If I'm doing a row, that's a traction force. If I'm rowing, the traction force on my elbow joint between my humerus and my radius, then that's a traction force. So again, they can withstand high amounts of traction forces, such as rows, chin-ups, squats, push-ups, dips. They all put your joints in the correct alignment, and they can withstand high amounts of forces. Now, if I get my two hands, take your two hands, and I put them together, and if I get you to do this, slide them back and forth on each other, this way, and do it hard and fast, and you find it won't be long before you get this heat build up and this friction, and then you start to have that little rubbing on the skin and irritation. It's like if I'm scratching something, eventually I'm going to wear the skin away. So this force here is called a shearing force. A shearing force is where two articulating bones, two articulating surfaces go across. That's a shearing force. I guess it's like if I've got two lumps of wood, and I put the two lumps of wood together, and each of those wood represents a bone, and where they connect is the joint. And if I push the wood together, there's going to be no damage to the wood. If I pull the wood apart, there's no damage to the wood. But if I get the wood and I rub them across each other, then that's going to create heat, friction, and eventually wear and tear. Even if one of those pieces of wood has sandpaper on it, and the other one has no sandpaper, and I put the wood with the sandpaper on the normal wood and I push it together, the sandpaper is not going to have a wearing effect on the wood because it's not, rubbing across it, it's just pushing into it. If I pull the sandpaper wood away from it, it's not going to cause any damage. But if I rub the sandpaper across it, back and forth, then that's how you're going to wear down the wood, and that would wear down the joint, and that would start with wearing down the articular cartilage, and then eventually wear and tear leading into arthritis, osteoarthritis, which is the degeneration and wear and tear of a joint. So any exercise or movement pattern, better still, movement pattern that creates this force. Now to do that, there has to be a force going across. I've got one force going that way, or one force going that way, or just one force going that way and the other one not. So to get that movement pattern, there has to be a force going across the joint to push those two bones across each other. So any movement pattern, or with a load on the movement pattern that goes across the joint, as I said with the Lego pieces, if I hit across the Lego pieces, they'll snap because that's fairly weak. So not only do you create wear and tear on the joint by loads going across the joint, but if there's a bit of compression there as well, then I'm going to have this friction across the two bony surfaces causing shearing forces. So what movement patterns put stresses across joints? Well, most movement patterns that are isolated exercises, single joint isolated exercises with a load. So if I put a load in my hand and I go this way, where the load is going this way, it's going that way, so all the force is going that way. Now that's going to push the radius that way while my humerus is here, so that's going to cause the radius to want to do that. And if I go up and down, then I've got this, it might only be small, but if I have a piece of sandpaper and I do little ones, it's still going to wear and tear, particularly if I've got a large load, and that large load will represent I've got a load pushing those two surfaces together. So I have a large load with a long lever, which we'll talk about later. So any movement which is a single movement, isolated, like a front raise or side raise, or you can't see it, but my knee extension, doing like a leg extension exercises, then all those movements are single joint, and most of them are what we call a third class lever action. And the third class levers are designed not for the generation of high amounts of force, but they're designed for leverage to create high movements, large movements with acceleration. So a lot of these third class lever movements are designed for hunting, I suppose. For example, we got the Olympics at the moment, for example, and I'll use a classic example, and there's the event called the shot put. Now, we don't call it the shot throw, we call it the shot put, because it's a large weight, it's a big steel ball, and what they do is they go and they put, means they push it this way, which is compression forces that way, because it's a heavy load. If they try to get that shot put and throw it this way, which is putting the stress across the joints, not only is it a weak position, try to do it with a heavy shot, you just wouldn't be able to do it, because it's a weak joint position. It's a very unstable, weak position, plus the load's going across the joint, which will cause a lot of discomfort and pain in the joints, and eventually wear and tear and injury. So we don't throw the shot put that way, we put it that way. If you go and get a very large rock in the garden, try to pick up the very large rock and throw it with the forces going across the joint. You wouldn't be able to do it because it puts the joint in a weak position, plus the loads going across the joint that cause aggravation on the joints, and you probably feel straight away pain doing it that way as well. So if you want to throw a large rock, you're going to put it through compression forces. So exercises that are more isolated in nature, that the load goes across the joint, which is most of the weight training isolation single joint movement patterns that people do in the gym, apply a load to a joint through a weak angle, because the loads are going across the joint, across the Lego pieces, not through them, so it's very weak and unstable. And that's going to create also not just as a weak and unstable position due to it can increase the chances of injury, but also you're going to create those shearing forces. And if you do that repetitively with a significant load, with a heavier load, then that's going to create an accumulation of wear and tear on the joint that will lead to degeneration of the joint, tendonitis, osteoarthritis, capsulitis, whatever it might be, fragmentation of your cartilage. So a lot of the isolation exercises, loaded, repetitive, and frequently performed, will create are not the best way to load a joint in the long term to maintain joint integrity for your professional career or your personal career. If I also do this movement pattern, if I get you both hands again, and this time I rotate, right? I rotate the hands again, I actually feel my skin heating up straight away. I get the little curls of skin rolling up in my hand because that's friction. So any movement pattern has compression with rotation on a repetitive way with a high force on it is again also going to be contraindicated in terms to joint integrity. So if I'm getting heavy weights through my spine and I'm rotating like this, I'm rotating like this with a heavy weight, then that's going to cause a lot of shearing forces, rotational shearing forces through that joint that's moving, which might be my L4, L5, which is the number one joint in the vertebral column that is susceptible to injury, susceptible to degeneration, a bulging disc, a split disc, a herniated disc. It's the number one site for injury. As the number one site for injury in the shoulder is the glenohumeral joint through all these type of movement patterns we do up here, and also rotation in the knee. So anything with compression loaded with rotation is going to increase the risk of injury due to increasing the stresses in that joint. What I want you to understand is what's happening in the joint. Don't just think that's a bad exercise. Look at the joint and be able to justify so you know why it's not the best exercise, because you can actually see what's happening to the articular surface, or the ligaments if they're going this way, or the tendons if they're getting worn across that particular joint. So shearing forces, rotational forces, shearing with the rotation, and if you add on top of that forces going across the joint, and most of those will come from single joint movements, or what we call isolated exercises with a heavy load. Now don't get me wrong, these joints are designed for single joint movements if you need them. If I'm throwing a stone this way, right, then yes, if I just watched in the Olympics the discus, they spin and they throw. Now understanding sport is slightly different because sport is the extreme forms of performance. However, whether it be shot put, we're not throwing it, we're putting it, because that's just going to be injurious, high risk of injury. The discus, yes, we're flinging the discus with the rotation, but we're using a light weight. We're not using a massive heavy weight. So yes, the movement pattern is rotation. They have to do that for the sporting action. However, it's not using a very heavy weight. If you go back to hunter and gatherer days, then yes, we do movement patterns which are in these positions, but we don't do it repetitively with a heavy load. If you look at Ugg, the caveman, he gets up, he says to his wife, I'm going hunting, and he grabs his spears and he walks off to the hunting ground, and then he sees the deer that he wants to spear for dinner. So he sneaks up and he hides behind the rock and he goes behind the tree and he spends a bit of time stalking it, and eventually he throws the spear and he misses, and he goes, oof, I missed. And how many times did he throw it? Once. He picks up his spear and the deer runs away, and he has to stalk the deer again, and he sneaks up it again, and over the course of the day the spear doesn't weigh 20 kilograms like a 20 kilogram shoulder press, because I wouldn't be able to throw 20 kilograms very far. If I did, it would hurt my shoulder. And then I throw it again. So how many times does he throw it? Not that many, but he throws it very cautiously and very precisely. However, what we do in the gym is we go in with our 20 kilograms and we do very heavy weights, and we pound and pound, and we do it every single day or every second day. So the accumulation of high amounts of stress with high loads going through the joint will cause a wear and tear on that joint, and we're really accelerating that. So even though, yes, we can do some of these movement patterns which I'm talking about, we're capable of doing it, but we don't do them on the basis of heavy loaded and high repetition and very frequently. For example, if I'm going into, and I'll talk more about the shoulder joint, if Ugg now has to go across the river to get to the hunting ground, yes, he puts his spear in his back, he jumps in the river and he swims across, and he eventually gets to the other side. And how many laps does he do? He does 1 lap. Then he goes hunting, then he comes back home and he swims across the river, and how many laps is that? That's his 2nd lap. So he does 2 laps. However, if Ugg went across, did 2 hours of back and forth the lap 2 times a day, 6 days a week in preparation for the Ugg Olympics, then eventually his shoulder's going to wear out, because even though his shoulder is capable of doing that action, it's not designed to do that on a repetitive nature, on a frequent nature, because it's not designed for high amounts of repetitive forces. And then Ugg goes and gets his big Ugg rocks in his Ugg rock gym, and he starts lifting heavy weights. Then he's going to wear and tear that joint out very, very quickly and accelerate these sport-specific injuries that he would get from swimming, but it's accelerating in the gym. So you have to make sure that even if you're training for a sport, that you don't try to overload too much, too frequently, too repetitively the movement pattern in your sport, because your sport's is already causing a lot of degeneration of that joint. And you go into the gym and you might be just accelerating the event of an injury from that movement pattern. So we've talked about compression and traction, which are fine. We talked about rotation. We talked about shearing. Now, all movements will create a little bit of shearing forces by all means, but a shearing force with a perpendicular load through it, such as in a lot of the isolation exercise, is really going to maximize that shearing effect and maximize that stress going across the joint. Now, if I bend my knees, yes, I'm getting knee flexion, there's compression, and there'll be a little bit of shearing forces. But if I take the load directly across the knee, such as a leg extension, then that is a direct impact of high force going through the joint that over time could lead to wear and tear and an injury. So other movement patterns to be aware of is, I talked about the shoulder a fair bit, is anything above head. So this is the glenohumeral joint. If you look at the articular structure of the joint, or the architecture of the joint, it's a very shallow joint, the glenoid cavity where the head of the humerus sits in. It's not a deep cavity because it's not a weight-bearing cavity. It's designed for mobility, not stability, as opposed to the acetabulum, which is your hip joint where your femur goes into acetabulum. It is a deep joint and it's designed for stability because it is a weight-bearing joint. That's why it can lift heavy loads through the hip, and it's going to be very stable, and it's very difficult to dislocate the hip, but it's quite easy to dislocate or sublux the shoulder joint, which is exactly what I did to my Olympic athlete when I got them to do a heavy weight above the head. I took the weight behind that creates a force going across the joint with rotation of the joint. So I've got force going across and rotation in what we call the dislocation position, because if I want to dislocate someone's shoulder joint, I take the shoulder up and I laterally rotate it, and that would dislocate my joint if I kept going that way. If I go too far the other way, that's okay, but what I do then, if I go too high, I compress the tendon underneath these two bony surfaces called the acromion process and the head of the humerus, and there's a tendon under there called your supraspinatus, and that would tend to be impinged. Impingement means it gets compressed between two bones, impinged, and if I do a lot of weight and movement up there, I'm going to wear and tear that tendon over time, and that's called tendinitis, or shoulder impingement can lead to tendinopathy, and then eventually a tendon tear of the supraspinatus, which is the most common injury that you get in the shoulder joint. So what I'm saying is any movement above the head is fine, but if you start loading it up with a load with a joint that's not designed for stability but it's designed for mobility, and I do repetitive exercises, whether it be chin-ups up here, particularly if I go out here wide, which is dislocation position, with pronated, which puts that shoulder position more impingement, because shoulder impingement is more, can happen more often if you take your shoulder and shoulder abduction and medial rotation, because the medial rotation of the humerus positions the tendon, the supinatus tendon, directly underneath the acromion process. If you go lateral rotation, it takes it away out from underneath the acromion process, which is less likely for impingement, but it's still a very unstable position. So any heavy repetitive weight exercises above the head is going to be quite dubious from a safety point of view, because it's an unstable position in a joint that's not designed for heavy loads, repetitive heavy loads in a frequent nature. Yes, we're designed to take my pillow and put it on the top shelf, but if you were working in the workforce and your boss required you to pick up heavy boxes and lift them up and put them into a shelf, lift up a heavy box above the head and put it in the shelf, then the workplace health and safety officer would come down so hard on you, because from a workplace health and safety, we know in countries where they do have workplace health and safety rules, that is just not allowed, because you will be in so much trouble, because that is an unsafe position. Heavy loads above your head, a lot of the time you're not allowed to lift a weight above waistline to put it in there, because once you go up here, that is a workplace health and safety hazard. But what's interesting, in our profession, you can go into the gym and do the same movement patterns which are deemed a workplace health and safety hazard, where you'd get massive fines if you ask your employees to do that. But if you go to the gym, hey, that must be different. We'll get you to lift heavy loads above the head in the same movement patterns that you do in the workplace, which you get fined for and be in massive amounts of trouble, particularly if you got injured and sued for. But in the gym, hey, let's give you these movement patterns which are contraindicated, because we're building muscle for the shoulder press or whatever it might be. So again, I'm not necessarily attacking any exercises. I'll let you be able to be smart enough to work that one out, but understand those movement patterns above here have a higher risk when it comes to joint integrity and joint safety. So anything above the head is a challenge. Isolation movements is a challenge. Anything goes across makes the joints do this is a challenge. This is a challenge. And it's not that the joints can't do this, because they can, but they're not designed to do that with a heavy load repetitively, frequently, because all you're doing is accelerating the aging wear and tear process of your joints, and before you know it, by the time you're 40, you're suffering from joint pain, joint discomfort, osteoarthritis, inflammation that will lead to rheumatoid arthritis. So movement patterns are anything above the head, beware. When you've got to be careful about your spine as well, because your spine, your vertebral column, particularly L4, L5, which is prone for injury, that's your back, which is 80% of the population will get some form of back pain sometime throughout their life. So again, the vertebral column is designed with individual Lego pieces. They're designed for compression, designed to be sitting on top of each other, not have forces going across. So as soon as you have a load here and you bend forward and you compromise the natural curvature of your spine by going into this rounded position, what you're doing is you're opening up the Lego pieces or the joints like this. That's causing unequal forces going through the joint with a load across the joint, which are called shearing forces, and that's going to, over time, going to accelerate the chances of intervertebral joint injuries, such as degeneration of the joint, whether it be creating a prolapse disc, a herniated disc, or a slip disc. I won't go into details of that, but yeah, there are a lot of people who have back operations, because whether it be the neck or the lower back, because of movement patterns that encourage you to go in that position with a heavy load and lifting weights. And the last thing to consider is, when you lift a heavy weight, if it's going to be a strong weight, you have to lift it with control, because at least if you have control, you have control of the muscles that stabilize the joints. Remember, the muscles stabilize the joints. So any movement pattern that involves momentum, a load with momentum, like you see a lot of movement patterns now where they're swinging weights around and they're swinging the weights up there and swinging them over here and swinging them up there. Again, if you look at the movement pattern of that, you've got a lot of time isolation movements through the joints. You have the stress or the load going across the joint. You have the joints going through shearing with rotational forces. And now you've got momentum with the load at the end of the lever. And the longer the lever and the load more towards the end of the lever, the greater forces go through the axis of rotation, or the movement action through the joint. So long lever movements with momentum is going to, again, heighten the risk of potential wear and tear, all the stresses, shearing forces, rotational forces, all the stresses on the menisci, on the tendons, on the ligaments, and on the bursas, with a repetitive, in a frequent manner, is probably not going to end well. Now, I know, again, I said I'm watching the Olympics, and in the Olympics they do movement patterns. I watched the gymnastics last night, and yes, these elite athletes, they put their shoulders and their bodies through amazing positions with amazing amount of force, with amazing amount of repetition, and they get there, and most of them are very young. And I know enough retired gymnasts, by the time they get to their 40s and their 50s, their joints are just full of arthritis or seized up. They've had many operations. One of the ladies who picked up the silver medal last night, she had already had 3 knee reconstruction surgeries already. But again, the reward is massive, so they're prepared to take the risk to push their body to the elite level, to be able to put their body through these unnatural human positions, doing the gymnastics, whether it be the Roman rings or doing the somersaults on the floor or doing the pommel horse or the vault or the parallel bars. And yes, they have to do things which are not naturally normal for humans to do, and that's why we watch them, because they go, oh my gosh, that is crazy, that is crazy. And it is crazy, but it's crazy on the joints. And yes, my hat off to what they've done, but don't take what they do and put it into your exercise program if you want to be fit, healthy and strong and maintain your joints for the rest of your life. They're quite happy to take that risk, the risk return, because they're happy to get the return of the gold medal that satisfies them in many different ways, emotionally, psychologically, socially, financially. Yeah, they prepared to take that, as I'm prepared to take that risk in my sport of martial arts. I'm prepared to take the hits or do the spinning kicks, which for the average person would hurt their back, but for me, because I'm conditioned to it. But that doesn't mean I'm not full of injuries, because I am. But I'm happy to, I'm happy to live with those injuries, because I got those injuries doing something which I found the rewards were worth the risk. But if you're just training for health and well-being, and you want to have a live healthy, active life into your 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, then be sure that you don't choose exercises in your exercise program that are going to give you 90-year-old hips, lower back, shoulder joints at the age of 40, because you've worn them out and accelerated the wear and tear of them so quickly through exercises that definitely work the muscles, but they put the joints in compromising positions. They apply unnatural forces in the wrong biomechanical angles that cause wear and tear, whether it be shearing forces, rotational forces, whatever it might be, torsion forces that cause a lot of wear and tear in the joint. So yes, if you look at the Olympics and the Olympic lifting, yes, they take the heavy weight above. It's quite amazing the amount of weight they lift above their head. Some are lifting 3 times their own body weight above the head, and some up to 2 times their own body weight in acceleration. But that's called Olympic lifting. That's called a sport. Yes, they do these unnatural movements with unnatural weight in an unnatural way that makes the audience go, wow. But if you try to take that exercise and give that to the general population, the benefit of what they get out of that is so small compared to the risk. And the risk is that you'll not be able to do anything, because your joints will be technically stuffed, because without the joints you haven't got much at all, because you can't even work the muscles to do the things you want to do with your life throughout your entire life. So there's some look at different movement patterns and stresses and forces and angles and joint positions to be wary of. Whether that the main sites I looked at were obviously the shoulder, the lower back, and obviously the knee. Again, if you put forces across the knee, it's not designed that way. Forces are designed to go through the knee, not across the knee. Because if you look at a lot of the time when people get ACL tears, anterior cruciate ligament tears, is when their knees slightly bent and they rotate and they get hit from the side, as in rugby league. But that doesn't mean we have to go and try to do those movement patterns in these dynamic, explosive type movements, jumping over boxes with somersaults and landing on our head and then doing a roll and a star jump, climbing up ropes. And yeah, that's all great if you're a monkey, because monkeys are designed to do all of those things. If you look at the architecture of the skeletal system of the monkey, then yes, they're designed to do that. You know, lizards or dogs are designed to be on all fours. That doesn't mean that we have to design exercise programs or classes and we call them animal classes and we run around like a gorilla, a monkey or a snake or whatever it might be, because if you do that, then you're going to get injured. As if I get a monkey or a dog to do what humans do in an upright position, their joints and their skeletal systems are not designed for that posture, and they're going to get injured if I try to make a dog be a human and me try to be a dog or a monkey or a gorilla, a snake, a lizard, or whatever it might be. So there's some thoughts when you're looking at movement patterns and how you train. Also look at function. You know, is this exercise functional? Does it relate to my daily life activities? You know, do I need to get on the ground and do a plank on my toes and with the force going through my back? Obviously, yes, I feel in the abs trying to stabilize my back to withstand a 90-degree force going straight across my back in gravity. And if you look at all my vertebrae, they're this way and the gravity's that way. So I get these shearing forces, I get this force going directly across in a dysfunctional position, because why would I put myself in a plank position unless I'm a lizard? Because I'm not. That's not how I function. I function in the upright position. So why do I train on the ground when I function in the upright position? So always overlay everything, even before you even get down to the anatomy and the biomechanics of the skeletal system and the joints. Just look at the exercise and how does this relate to what I want to achieve, and how does this relate to my life, and how does this relate to my sport, and how is this functional? And if I look back when I gave my Olympic athlete overhead tricep extensions, I look at that directly. I wouldn't even go any further, because there's nothing apart about kayaking, which is here, that is anything related to over here. But if I go through the process of the anatomical analysis and biomechanical analysis of this, it would come out saying that is a completely inappropriate exercise, not just for the benefit of the sport, but inappropriate from the safety of the joint. So think for yourself, go out there, put your x-ray goggles on and start looking at movement patterns of exercises and start to make better choices to give your clients the benefit and help them achieve their results effectively, efficiently, but most of all, safely. See you in the next Kmax.